To appreciate the three descriptives applied to that of Yerushah, Mecher, and Matana, we must turn to the common usage of these three terms, and from there apply the symbolism to Torah. These three terms are primarily used to describe the process of the transfer of ownership from one domain to another. In very broad terms, the transfer that comes through Yerushah, inheritance, takes effect immediately following the death of the original owner. Worded differently, the children of the deceased obtain a right to the property of the parent, and this right is formalized following the parent's death. This, of course, is an oversimplification. Nowadays, the transfer of the ownership is much more complex, requiring the services of professional individuals such as lawyers. A second category of ownership transfer takes place through the process of mechira, while the third method, in which wealth in the form of property, shares, etc. are transferred, comes about through the process of what is known as matana, the gifting of those items from one entity to another. In comparing the three processes from the standpoint of the recipient, the process of mechira is generally the most straightforward, in that there is a transfer, in most cases, of money from the recipient to the owner, and in return, the recipient takes ownership of the item for which he or she paid. In other words, there is an equal set of forces that come to play, one from the recipient to the original owner, and then from the original owner to the recipient. This in contrast to the Yerushah and Matana processes, whereby in the case of Yerushah, the item transfers automatically to the recipient, in this case the child or children, as part of the inheritance. In the case of Matana, the item is generally given to the recipient, but not on account of the fact that the recipient had paid for that item one way or another. Nowadays, the lines of demarcation between Yerushah and Matana have become somewhat blurred with the writing of a will, in which he or she allocates wealth, not necessarily on the basis of any biological link. Inheritance is the practice of passing on property, titles, debts, rights, and obligations upon the death of an individual. Debts, incidentally, applies to taxes, the repayment of loan, and other obligations. In its original concept, one merely needed to establish a biological relationship in order to receive a portion of the inheritance. This right began upon the birth of the child. Nowadays, where we have blended families, the laws of inheritance have been expanded to include stepchildren as well as adopted children who can make a claim to receive part of the inheritance. Applying the concept of Yerushah as expressed in Devarim 33:4, that Torah is a morasha kihilat Yaakov, the term Yerushah would apply to a spiritual relationship in which a Jew, by virtue of birth or by virtue of choice through Gerut, has an intrinsic connection to Torah and Judaism. This intrinsic connection, as in the case of inheritance laws, exists beyond the subgroups within Judaism and applies equally to both the practicing and the non-practicing Jews. Two examples can be brought to demonstrate the Yerushah concept of Torah. The first comes to us from Midrashic Zoharic literature and is built upon the observation that there are 600,000 letters, give or take, that make up a Sefer Torah. The number 600,000 is also the number of Jews who departed Egypt, which is linked to the word Yisrael through an acrostic, in which each letter spells out a word. The Yud Yesh, the Shin Reish Shishim Riboy, the Aleph Otiot, the Lamed La Torah, that the name Yisrael reflect the approximate 600,000 letters in the Torah, suggesting a link between anybody who claims to be part of Am Yisrael with a letter in the Torah. Of course, nowadays there are certainly more than 600,000 Jews in the world, and as this is a Kabbalistic concept, it could be argued that here we are referring to Yisrael at the neshama level, which, according to Kabbalistic teachings, numbers 600,000. A second indication of a connection between Yisrael, the people, and the Torah comes from a halachic ruling of the Rambam regarding the obligation of Limud Torah, the study of Torah, where the Rambam in Hilchot Talmud Torah Perek Aleph writes that Kol Ish Mi Yisrael, every single Jew, man and woman, is chayav, obligated, with Talmud Torah, to study Torah, both in the limited sense of the Torah Shebiktav and also in the broader sense of Torah Shebal Peh. The Rambam bases this requirement upon a pasuk, V'higita bo yomam v'layla, recorded in Sefer Yehoshua, Perek Aleph, in which God, in his first communication with Yehoshua, without Moshe Rabbeinu, informs him that Lo Yamush Sefer HaTorah Hazeh Mipicha. The words of this Sefer Torah should not depart from your mouth. V'higita bo yomam v'layla. You are to study it both day and night. L'man tishma la'asot k'chol hakatuv bo, in order that you should know how one is to observe all that is written in that document. The Rambam broadens the interpretation of this command to Yeshua by applying it to every single Jew, and the Rambam writes that this obligation of an active involvement in the study of Torah applies equally to both rich or poor, healthy or in poor health, young or old, even to those people relying upon charity. It also applies to people despite the fact there may be challenges with respect to the allocation of time on account of family obligations, etc. That whatever the circumstances are, chayiv likvoa lo zman, one is obligated to set aside a set period each day, the Talmud Torah, for the study of Torah, bayom u'balayla, both by day and by night, thus demonstrating a symbolic link to the Torah across the board. It begins at birth and ends at death.